Welcome to this edition of the Native News Update. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories you hear can be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com or check out some more of our programs at IndianCountryTV.com. Here's the news stories for the day from the Associated Press and other Native American news services. On the Okanagan Plains in northeast Washington, the Colville tribes recently buried a man who passed away after facing a bleak decision: spend his money on trips into town for dialysis or buy food for his family. It was a variant of a fate that has due many people on a stark, remote reservation, causing the timber-dependent tribes to increasingly spend their money on burials. It's a choice between feeding your family and living, said Andy Joseph Jr., a Colville Confederated Tribes Council member. Our people can't afford to pay for their funeral services. From the isolated reservations across the state to urban pockets around Seattle, Washington, Native Americans are dying at higher rates than a decade ago, at a time when most people in Washington are living longer and healthier lives. A recent State Department of Health report showed that the march against cancer, heart disease, and infant mortality has largely bypassed Native American communities. In 2006, the latest year studied, Native American men were dying at the highest rate of all people in the United States, with little change since the early 1990s. Their life expectancy was 71, the lowest age of all men, and 6 years lower than that of white men. The news was just as grim for Native American women. Their death rate had surged by 20% in a 15-year period, while the overall death rate had decreased by 17%. But the starkest health disparity was among babies. Native American babies were dying at a rate 44% higher than a decade ago, while the overall rate of infant deaths had declined. One of two men charged in the 1975 slaying of a Canadian woman active in the American Indian movement wants prosecutors to outline the specifics of their case against him in a separate document. But U.S. Attorney Marty Jackley argued that Richard Marshall has all the information he needs to defend himself on charges he provided the gun that co-defendant John Graham allegedly used to kill Anime Pictou-Aquash. Both men pled not guilty to charges they committed or aided and abetted the first-degree murder of Aquash, a Micmac from Pictou, Nova Scotia, on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1975. Their trial is scheduled to start May 12th in Rapid City, South Dakota. Marshall's lawyer, Dana Hanna, asked the judge to dismiss the case against Marshall on the grounds the government has inconsistent theories about his involvement and that it waited too long, 33 years, to charge him. Jackley's response said the indictment is not vague and that the government court documents already have spelled out the information Marshall seeks. It includes the allegation that Marshall gave a .32 caliber revolver and shells to Graham, Theda Clark, and Arlo Looking Cloud when the trio stopped by Marshall's house with Aquash on December 12, 1975, the night she's alleged to have been killed, he wrote. Marshall has acknowledged in court documents that Aquash was at his house that night and that she was possibly bound and held against her will, the prosecutor wrote. Jackley wrote that Marshall even offered in his own court filing the argument he couldn't have provided the gun because he was awaiting trial on a charge he killed Martin Montalou on March 1, 1975, a crime for which he was ultimately convicted. As a condition of pretrial release from jail on that charge, Marshall's rifle and shotgun were at his late mother and stepfather's house, his lawyer argued. Jackley wrote an obvious flaw with that argument is the Aquash murder weapon was a handgun, not a rifle or a shotgun. Serpent River First Nation Chief Isidore Day of Ontario continues to speak with the province about all proposed water power projects on the Serpent River watershed, and the message is, don't let the public get the wrong message. Chief Day is also quite straight to the point about proposed developers. We are First Nations. We must first work through our issues with Ontario. Any developer must know that Serpent River First Nation citizens will be the developers and the beneficiaries of the resource development in the Serpent River watershed. It's that simple, says Chief Day. Over the past 3 years, Serpent River First Nation has been actively communicating their right to development and benefit from resources within their traditional territory to the provincial government. Working in an environment of government-to-government decision-making has been consistent in the Serpent River First Nation and Ontario relationship. The assertions that we have been making with government are being taken seriously because we are talking about Aboriginal rights and treaty territory, says Chief Day. Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar announced that the Indian Affairs Office of Indian Energy and Economic Development, in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Energy's Argonne National Laboratory, has launched a website to create a web-based clearinghouse of environmental information that will support American Indian and Alaskan Native traditional and renewable energy resource development. The Tribal Environmental and Energy Information Clearinghouse, which can be accessed online, creates a knowledge base for tribes and organizations that can assist them in capacity building efforts to develop environmental analysis and evaluate programs and processes that further their energy and economic development goals. In addition to environmental best practices, how-tos on conducting environmental assessments, and links to applicable federal and state laws, the Clearinghouse's database includes information on the various impacts of different types of traditional and renewable energy development. Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico has announced the appointment of Marvis Aragon Jr. of the Acoma Pueblo to serve as Deputy Secretary of the New Mexico Indian Affairs Department. Marvis Aragon is a leader among New Mexico's tribes, nations, and pueblos, and I'm confident his background in tribal operations, government, and business will be an asset to the Indian Affairs Department, said Richardson. Aragon is the former chief executive officer of the Acoma Business Enterprise, which includes Sky City Casino, Sky City Travel Centers, Sky City Communications, the Acoma Game and Fish, and the Acoma Land and Cattle Company, to name a few. He served 2 terms as the Pueblo's first lieutenant governor. He holds a bachelor's degree in management from the University of Phoenix at Arizona. The family of Ralph Eggleston said they're backing a $1 million scholarship endowment for American Indian students at the University of North Dakota. The Engelstad Family Foundation has released a statement that confirmed what many suspected since the scholarship was established in the year 2006. The program provides scholarships to about 4 students who are enrolled members of Sioux tribes in the Dakotas. When the scholarship program was announced, some criticized it as a bribe to gain approval for the Fighting Sioux nickname and logo. The Engelstad Family Foundation has also pledged $20 million in 2007 to the UND Foundation to support scholarships and endowed professorships. Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribal Chairman James Steele Jr. says the interests of Montana's tribes are the same as those of other Montanans. Steele delivered the biennial State of the Tribal Nations address this week before a joint session of the Montana House and Senate. He said tribes are not just political special interest groups seeking help when it comes to writing the policies of the state. We are not racial groups who happen to live in a particular land base and want what other interest groups want, Steele said. We are successors to the interest of those who signed the treaties with the United States that allowed Montana to be created. And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. Thanks for joining us.